If there's one AWS service that shows up in almost every single AWS Developer Associate exam question about serverless deployments and security, it's API Gateway. And if you don't understand it deeply, you will fail questions that you really shouldn't fail. In this video, I'm breaking down everything API Gateway you need to know for the AWS Developer Associate exam, mapped directly to the official exam guide domains, so you know exactly why each piece matters. API Gateway comes in three flavors: REST APIs, HTTP APIs, and WebSocket APIs. The exam will make you pick the right one for a scenario, so let's nail this down. REST APIs are the full-featured option. You get request validation, mapping templates, caching, API keys, usage plans, and resource level policies. If the question mentions any of those features, REST API is your answer. HTTP APIs are the newer, cheaper, faster version. They support Lambda and HTTP integrations, JWT authorizers, and course headers. But they drop caching, request validation, and API keys. The exam will describe a scenario where a team wants the lowest cost and lowest latency for a simple proxy. That is HTTP API. WebSocket APIs flip this model entirely. Instead of request response, the client and server maintain a persistent two-way connection. Think real-time chat applications, live dashboards, or multiplayer games. The exam will test whether you know when to use this kind of real-time communication instead of REST. When API Gateway receives a request, it needs to know what to do with it. That's what integration types define. First integration type is a AWS proxy, also called Lambda Proxy. It passes the entire request as is to a Lambda function. The Lambda function is responsible for formatting the response correctly with the status code, headers, and body. If the Lambda returns the wrong format, API Gateway throws a 502 bad gateway error. Remember that. Next integration type is AWS non-proxy. Here you define mapping templates to transform the request before it hits your backend, and transform the response before it goes back to the client. This is what response request transformation means in the exam guide. And then there's mock integration. API Gateway returns the response without ever calling a backend. Useful for development when your downstream service isn't ready yet, but you already have to return something to the clients. The exam gives you a scenario and asks you to pick the right authorization mechanism. There are four main options, and mixing them up is a common mistake. Option number one, IAM authorization. The caller signs the request using signature version 4, known as SigV4. This is for AWS services or backend-to-backend calls where the caller has an IAM role. You can also use resource policies to allow or deny access by AWS account, IP range, or VPC endpoint. Next authorization mechanism is Lambda authorizers. You write a Lambda function that returns before your actual backend. There are two subtypes: a token authorizer, which receives a bearer token with a JWT or auth token, and a request authorizer, which receives the full request, including headers, query parameters, and a path. The authorization result can be cached with a TTL that you configure. Cognito user pool authorizer. If your users are authenticated through Amazon Cognito, API Gateway can validate their JWT directly with no Lambda function needed. This is simpler and lower latency than Lambda authorizer for Cognito-based applications. And finally, API keys with usage plans. These are for mattering and throttling, not for security. If a question asks how to track usage by a specific developer or partner, this is your answer. But never use an API key alone to secure access. This is probably the most heavily tested area for domain 3, so pay close attention. A stage in API Gateway is named snapshot of your API deployment. Think of it like an environment label: dev, test, production. Each stage has its own URL and its own configuration, throttling limits, caching settings, and most importantly, stage variables. Stage variables are key value pairs you attach to a stage. They act like environment variables for the deployment. Here's the killer use case. Instead of hard-coding which Lambda function an API calls, you write the integration URI using a stage variable. Just one example. There are tons of other scenarios for stage variables. Now when you deploy to your dev stage, you set lambda ls equals dev. On prod, you set it to prod. One API configuration, two completely different Lambda function versions. The exam frames this as what requires the least configuration to support multiple environments. And stage variables with Lambda aliases is the answer. For Canary Deployments, API Gateway lets you route a percentage of traffic to a new deployment while the rest stays on the current version. Once you are confident, you promote the Canary and 100% of the traffic shifts over. This is the blue-green deployment pattern applied to API Gateway. Domain 4 tests your ability to diagnose problems. Let's lock in the most important API Gateway error codes. 400 bad request. The client sent a request that failed your API request validation. 401 unauthorized, missing or invalid auth token. 403 forbidden. The request is authenticated but not allowed, often blocked by a resource policy or WEF rule. 429 too many requests. The client hit your throttle limit. 504 gateway timeout. This one is huge. API Gateway has a hard maximum integration timeout of 29 seconds. If your Lambda takes longer than that to respond, API Gateway drops the connection and returns 504 response code. Your Lambda may still be running in the background, but the client got a timeout. This is a very common exam scenario. 502 bad gateway. The Lambda returned the response, but it wasn't in the correct format. A proxy integration expects a specific JSON structure, status code, headers, body. If your Lambda returns something else, you get 502. For throttling, remember the hierarchy. AWS account limits apply first, 10,000 requests per second, 5,000 burst by default. The per stage limits, then the per method limit, then per client limit via usage plans. Exceeding any of these returns 429. For caching, response caching is configured per stage with TTL of up to 3600 seconds. You can override caching at the method level. Clients can bypass a cache by sending a cache control header if you enable that option. To observe all of this, you need CloudWatch logs. Enable execution logging to see request response details. Let's do a quick recap of what you know about API Gateway for the Developer Associate exam. In Domain 1, REST versus HTTP versus WebSocket API types, proxy versus non-proxy integrations, mapping templates, and mock integrations. In Domain 2, 4 authorizer types, IAM with SIG v4, Lambda authorizers for custom tokens, Cognito user pool authorizers, and API keys for mattering only. In Domain 3, stages as environment snapshots, stage variables to point to Lambda aliases, Canary deployments for traffic shifting, and custom domains with ACM. Thanks for watching and good luck on your exams.